This episode of Messed Up Origins was brought to you by Audible. If you want to support the show and get something back for your generosity, go to audibletrial.com/solo and get yourself any audiobook absolutely free. What is up, Solo fam? My name is John Solo, and boy do I have a story for you. The Adventures of Pinocchio is a book you guys have been begging me to check out, basically since Messed Up Origins started. After reading it, I understand why. We've covered a lot of stories on this show, diverse stories from all over the world. But in my opinion, not a single one is even close to being as straight up weird as Pinocchio. It reminds me of a book that would be written by Tom Bombadil. Some of you might not be surprised to hear that, because honestly, Disney's Pinocchio is a pretty weird movie. Like, why does this cat wear clothes and walk on hind legs while Figaro is a normal kitten? Seems that we have another Goofy vs. Pluto situation on our hands. But on top of being weird as butts, it has an incredibly messed up ending, possibly the most depressing we've read. We're gonna get all into that book in just a second. First, I want to recap the Disney movie so it's fresh in your head. Don't forget that if you want to support the channel and series, to smash that like button. It's been a really long time since we've hit our goal of 5,000 likes, so if you guys can somehow manage to reach it by this weekend, I'm gonna do an extra episode of Messed Up Origins next week. My hopes are high. Don't let me down, Solo fam. I need this. The movie opens with an Italian woodcarver named Geppetto finishing up his new marionette and naming him Pinocchio. That night, he wishes upon a star for the puppet to become a real boy, and the blue fairy grants his wish. The fairy tells Pinocchio that if he proves himself brave, truthful, and unselfish, he'll become a real human boy, and she assigns Jiminy Cricket to be his conscience. Geppetto is thrilled to find that Pinocchio's come to life, and the very next day sends him to school. Only Pinocchio gets distracted by a scumbag fox and cat who convince him to join Stromboli's puppet show for an easy path to fame and fortune. Even though he's a hit with the crowd, Pinocchio doesn't get any of the puppet show's revenue himself, and when he tries to go home, Stromboli locks him in a birdcage and their wagon takes off. The Blue Fairy comes to Pinocchio that night, and after making him and Jiminy promise to not make any more mistakes, she sets him free. Only he finds himself getting swindled once again into going to Pleasure Island with a group of misfit boys. It's on this island that young, stupid boys are encouraged to act on every impulse and desire they have. But after less than a day of degenerate behavior, the boys start transforming into donkeys and are sold to the salt mines as slaves. Pretty freaky. Pinocchio and Jiminy escape the island and learn that Geppetto was eaten alive by a giant whale named Monstro while searching for the missing puppet. Pinocchio takes on the responsibility of saving Geppetto himself, and despite the risk involved, he pulls it off successfully. Well, mostly successfully. He actually dies in the process, but because he acted so bravely and selflessly to save his father, the Blue Fairy brings him back to life as a real human boy, and that weird little family lives happily ever after. I'll be honest, Pinocchio always freaked me out as a kid. I hated Stromboli and the part where the kids turn into donkeys. Also, it's from 1940. I'm not the only one who finds something creepy about old movies, right? Anyways, if you thought that was crazy, remember that Disney has always toned down the harsher elements of these stories, including the character of Pinocchio himself. Carlo wrote The Adventures of Pinocchio to serve as a warning to children that always choosing to do what's easy and expedient and enjoyable will eventually get you into trouble, and that you're gonna have to work hard and suffer to reach your full potential. Because of that, we see Pinocchio make quite a few stupid decisions starting on the day he was first carved. The story starts with a wood craftsman named Antonio finding a block of pine wood that he's gonna turn into a leg for his table. Only as soon as he starts carving into it, the wood screams. Antonio is freaked out by the apparently magic wood and gives it to his poor neighbor Geppetto, who plans on starting a career as a puppeteer. He decides to use the wood to make his first puppet, Pinocchio, but right out of the gate, his behavior is downright rude, and a few other choice words I try not to use on this show. As soon as his nose is carved, it starts to grow longer the more he acts like a butthole to Geppetto. Right after his feet are carved, he kicks Geppetto in the shin, and immediately after learning how to walk, he runs out of the house and into town. When he gets into town, he runs into a police officer who assumes he's been mistreated by his father, because why else would he be running from him, and he arrests Geppetto. The most ridiculous part is Pinocchio doesn't even care. He brushes the incident off and goes back to his house, where he meets the character who inspired Jiminy Cricket, Rickety Cricket. Nah, he just meant a regular talking cricket. Unlike Jiminy Cricket, who set up camp in Geppetto's house the night Pinocchio was made, Talking Cricket says he's lived in the house for a century, and he warns Pinocchio that if he continues to misbehave, he'll have to suffer repercussions. Pinocchio didn't really feel like listening to the whole spiel though, so he decided to throw a hammer at the cricket, killing him. To be fair, it was an accident. He just wanted to throw the hammer near him, but still, sad. A century of life ruined by one rude puppet. Pinocchio fixes himself a meal and falls asleep with his feet on the stove, which results in them burning off. When Geppetto is released that night, he agrees to make Pinocchio some new feet if he goes to school the next day. He sells his only jacket for enough money to buy Pinocchio a textbook, and the next morning, Pinocchio takes it with him on his way to school. Only just like in the movie, he's distracted by a puppet show and decides to sell his textbook for a ticket. So disrespectful. Apparently, the puppets in the show were carved from the same block of wood as Pinocchio because they recognize him from the crowd and call out to him during the show. This effectively ruins the show for the rest of the crowd, and the terrifying puppet master Mangiafuoco holds Pinocchio personally responsible. He decides he's going to use the puppet as firewood to cook his meal later that night. The puppet master is a pretty interesting character. Listen to the way he's described in the book. A large man so ugly he evoked fear by simply being looked at. He had a beard as black as a smudge of ink and so long that it fell from his chin down to the ground, enough so that when he walked, he stepped on it. His mouth was as wide as an oven. His eyes were like two red-tinted lanterns with the light turned on at the back. And in his hand, he sported a large whip made of snakes and foxtails knitted together. This is the book's rendition of what he looks like, and this is mine. I think they're equally hideous. Now, while Mangiafuoco is a terrifying human being, he's surprisingly compassionate. When Pinocchio breaks down in sadness, telling him about his poor father Geppetto waiting for him at home, the puppet master feels sympathy, and he gives Pinocchio 5 gold coins to give to his father and sets him free. It'd be nice to hear that Pinocchio went home after all this, apologized to Geppetto, and gave him the gold coins to buy them a nice dinner and a new coat. Unfortunately, that would have gone against the entire purpose of this book, which I'll say again, was to show children what happens when you pursue what's expedient and enjoyable over what's difficult and truly rewarding. It's pretty much the opposite of the legend of Hercules, which we talked about a few weeks ago. He deliberately chose a severe and glorious life over a pleasant and easy life because he's the man. It's crazy that these stories were written over 10,000 years apart and have such a similar message. I mean, think about it. The legend of Hercules was one of the most popular stories throughout the entirety of ancient Rome and Greece's existence. This might blow your mind, but the story of Pinocchio is the second most translated book ever published, right behind the Bible, and it's one of the best-selling books of all time. I think there's a reason we humans gravitate towards stories with this kind of message. I think somewhere in our subconscious ancient brain we know this message to be a fundamental truth. Anyway, let's get back on track. On the way home, Pinocchio comes across a fox that's pretending to have a busted leg and a cat claiming to be deaf. Note that in the movie, the cat isn't deaf, but instead just doesn't talk. I like finding little changes like that. They tell Pinocchio that if he plants his 5 gold coins in a field outside the city of Catchfools, they'll sprout into gold coin trees. And see that bird in the upper left corner? He tries to warn Pinocchio that he's about to get played for a fool, but the cat eats him. Not a super important detail, but one I wanted you to know. Some of you might be wondering, how is Pinocchio eating up all this baloney? Is he that big of an Oscar Mayer fan? But you've got to remember, he's got the innocence of a child and a brain that's made of wood, so he wasn't born with the best baloney detector. I wish I had a literal baloney detector. I love baloney, and I hate looking for it at the store, because I always get lost. They offer to walk him to the city, and they con him into using one of his gold coins to pay for their expensive dinner at a nearby inn. They basically do that thing where when you're on a date, you have someone call you with a fake emergency just in case it's going terribly or the person's profile pictures were a little too flattering. Pinocchio falls asleep at the inn, and they duck out early, leaving behind a note saying there was an emergency and to meet them at the Field of Miracles the next morning. They go a ways ahead on the path and disguise themselves as bandits to try and rob Pinocchio of his last 4 coins when he walks by. They almost have him too, until Pinocchio bites off the cat's hand and makes a break for it for a nearby house where the fairy with turquoise hair lived. As you can probably guess, the fairy with the turquoise hair is what inspired the blue fairy in the movie. Pinocchio is banging on the door begging for help, but the fairy tells him that all of the house's inhabitants are dead, including herself, and she's waiting on her coffin. I don't know, I can't explain that one. Without her help, Pinocchio was caught by the bandits, who tie his hands behind his back and proceed to hang him from a tree. Only this isn't the quick style hanging that breaks your neck when you fall. They strung him up and lifted him by his neck off the ground, which means he was forced to suffocate while the fox and cat watched. Until they got bored of watching, I guess. Apparently it takes a while for a magic puppet to suffocate, and the two just walked away when they got bored. Which means that Pinocchio spent his last few moments alone, reflecting on the bad decisions he made and the tomfoolery that led to his death. Or at least that's how the original story goes. After The Adventures of Pinocchio was published and widely distributed, readers gave their feedback that they loved the story, but the ending was just too depressing. So Carlo's publisher requested him to expand on the story, resulting in Pinocchio being saved and another 15 chapters being written. I really wanted to make this episode about the very first rendition of the story, so in the next episode we're going to cover those additional chapters. Remember that it's up to you guys how soon that episode gets made. If you hit that like button and help us reach our goal of 5,000 likes, you can expect it on Tuesday of next week. After doing that, also make sure to subscribe and turn notifications on so you'll know when the episode is uploaded. Also, I wanted to give you guys a heads up. Right now I'm doing a fun little game with the Solo fam on Twitter, where anyone who responds to this tweet will get their username roasted in the next fan-made video. So if you want a chance to appear in the next fan-made video, follow my Twitter link in the description. And the rest of my social medias too, because I post a lot of fun stuff and not many of you guys are following me for some reason. Is it because you hate me? I also want to thank today's sponsor Audible for making this episode possible. If you want to support the channel and get yourself a little something in return, go to audibletrial.com/solo to get yourself any audiobook you want, absolutely free, including the Pinocchio one, by the way. Thank you all so much for watching, and of course for the support and the love. Until next time, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.